Welcome to Navigate. On today's podcast, we are going to be discussing the taxation around remote workers. And lucky for us, we were able to have Laurie Marsen ACCTS, join us. I've known Laurie for many years. She is an outstanding professional in her field. But the best thing is I get to call her friend. And so with that, Laurie, you want to introduce yourself a little bit further? Tell us a little bit about your background and your firm.
Okay, I can do that, Jim. Though I'm very pleased to call you friend as well. It was good to work for you, but it's better being a friend, I think. Anyway, so as Jim said, my name is Laurie Marsen. I specialize in what's called global mobility tax, which is basically people doing work around the world. I've been doing that since my husband dragged me to Germany before the turn of the century, actually. It was in 1997. I started working with one of the big firms in that field and basically have been doing the same thing for a couple of different big firms. And then finally decided that I could be my own boss and pick my own clients. And so I've switched out. So during that time, I've worked for great big companies, a lot of automotive companies doing cross-border work, a lot of little companies sending their first expat. And most recently, a lot of individuals that can't find anybody to help them with their taxes. And they've got these interesting scenarios where they married a foreigner or they are a foreigner from the US perspective. So non-US person, and having to deal with US taxes. So it's interesting to meet people.
Yeah, so those personal relationships that you develop are very, very important with your clients, and I can attest to the fact that you are very, very good at that part of the engagement process. So, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to talk a little bit about remote workers. We all know that with COVID, the world changed. All of a sudden, remote workers were always there. I don't think a lot of people thought about them. But with COVID, remote working became the way work was being done. There are some very specific tax questions we have to ask and get answered. There are a lot of questions just about moving to a foreign country, dealing with everything that might entail. But what I think we'll start the conversation with is describe for us in your mind what you see as remote working today and where you may see that going in the future. And then we'll get into some of the more technical things.
Okay, well, remote working, like you said, really has been around a long time. It just wasn't familiar to most people. COVID made it a household word, and everybody then decided, oh, I can work wherever I want to. I have all this flexibility. I can do whatever I want, and nobody can stop me. And they have these lenses on their thought process that if I'm from the US, let's just start with a US person. If I'm from the US and all my clients are US and I get paid in US dollars, that's all US tax matters. It doesn't matter where I am or what I'm doing with the money. And that sounds logical until you start realizing that the governments all think about where your feet are is where the work is actually being performed and who has the first right to tax you. Because you're in their zone, you're using their services. So they want to collect tax on what you're doing. So then that changes the dynamic a little bit because you focused on what you thought was all US. You've got that lens on, but you've got to take it off and start saying, wait a minute, where am I really going to be? And can I do it where I want to be? Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. So are we talking about this just in the sense of cross-border, US to Canada, US to Mexico, or anywhere else in the world? Does it encompass crossing state lines?
It's kind of the same thing with states. Maybe that's the easiest thing for some of our listeners to understand. You know, we know that If you're a small business and you want to have an employee in another state, you have to register in that state. You do employment stuff in that state. You have to pay sales tax. You may have to do an income tax return for your business, just crossing the state border. So the commonality with US states is we all speak the same language and are kind of on the same goal of how we want to collect taxes. When you cross an international border, everybody has a different view of how taxes should be. I mean, taxes are a political animal at the end of the day. And so there are a lot of the rules and a lot of things are taxed because it's trying to promote certain behaviors that the government wants in that area. So that's why taxing is different everywhere. Plus, some places have more resources, some don't. And so each area wants to tax for its own reasons. So it gets more complicated when you go to another country usually than another state, but it's kind of the same animal, if you will. So the same thought process works.
Well, how do we measure when we are in a situation where we have to pay taxes either in a state or in a foreign country?
Well, most countries and most states basically have rules that say once you've crossed this threshold, whether it's days of presence, whether it's amount earned, whether it's transactions, that's when you're subject to tax. Some of them are really low thresholds and some of them are kind of high. And so we kind of have to look at that specific area to area. Where the US has income tax treaties, generally we have about 183 days is kind of the rule for residency. And that's even a misnomer too, Jim, because a lot of people know the 183-day rule and they're all excited about it. That's resident tax issues. You can still be taxable in another country before you hit 183 days. It just depends on the scenario.
Well, give us an example where you may have taxation applied prior to reaching the 183-day mark.
Well, if we go to a country where we don't have a treaty, you don't have 183 days, you have domestic law. And many of them start at day one. You're a resident, you're using our services, you're benefiting from our keeping the borders good, whatever they want to say, you owe taxes right away. You go to a treaty, and usually there's a rule in there that's the services provision, and it basically says, if you're in the country and you haven't been there more than 183 days, and you're working for a company from the other country, and all your charges are staying in the country you came from, so that other country, then the country that you're doing the services in is going to waive the taxation, and they're not going to treat you as taxable there. So then you have to figure out, well, where are the charges being borne? Who is paying the salary ultimately? And so, you could go, and a lot of times companies send people, and they're going to send you to Germany, for example. But they want the German entity to pay for you to be there. Well, now all of a sudden you're taxable there immediately because the charges are there. They're not staying back here in the US. If you look at it, the flip side, some of our visas actually guarantee that the wages are paid by the US company. And so at that point, you can't pull the wages out of the US, even if they're here only 3 months, because of the visa that you got.
So is it the same if an individual is making the decision to go work in Spain for 6 months? Exact same.
Well, when we say individual, we kind of have to figure this out a little bit more defined. Are you a self-employed individual? So you're taking your company with you? Are you a contractor? So, you're not really employed and you're not really self-employed. You feel like you're a gig worker. You're self-employed, but you kind of feel different. It's kind of the same mode. When you do that, you take your company with you. It's really hard to leave your company behind when that's just you, and that's all there is to it.
Mm-hmm.
And some people say, well, my company says I can work wherever I want to. And so as an individual, I'm going. Well, no, you're going as an employee of that company. So there's some definitions that people kind of don't understand sometimes when they're thinking about it. They have a boss that doesn't know taxes, and the boss says, hey, yeah, you can go down to the Bahamas and work on the beach. I don't care. Maybe they should.
And why would they care? If they, let's say we had a middle market company, very talented employee, and says, my family lives in Colombia and I'd like to go, I can work remote from Colombia. Do you care? And the boss says, go. What does that mean for the US company that made that decision?
Right. So that US company, it's kind of like we just talked about, having an employee go to another state. And if you send them there, you have to register for employment tax. Probably have to register for your business. You might have to have a license. All of those same things are questions that need to be asked about your employee going to Colombia, because now you are a Colombian employer when your guy hits the ground, or girl. So now all of a sudden that action has brought you under the Colombian tax regime. Now, Jim, you're the company expert when it comes to income taxes and things like that cross-border. I'm just raising the flag on the employment tax side issues. And we're talking income taxes primarily, but remember, most countries have a social net. And so wages earned in a country typically are subject to that Social Security tax as well. The US has treaties with very few countries, I think it's 30-ish now, to avoid double Social Security. But if your employer sends somebody to Colombia and he's still reemployed by the US, he's now got US Social Security. And in theory, the company is liable for Colombian Social Security, and he might have a piece of it, as well as income taxes down there. But they're not registered because they just said, go, have fun. We don't care. Take your computer. Or maybe log into our system. So there's all those issues. Then, depending upon what this is advertising, so that's fine. But let's say it was an architect.
Okay.
Maybe there's laws that say you have to be licensed and registered.
Mm-hmm.
We have telemed now. Maybe you have to be a doctor down there and you have to be licensed. Oh, by the way, do you have a visa to even work there, or can you just be a tourist? So there's all these other things that come in. It's not just a little piece of tax. It's the rest of the laws around it.
Yeah, and I think that's the point that we're trying to make here, is that it's a lot more than just tax. Tax is important, and make sure that you pay the taxes, what the assessments are going to be, but there's so much more around it. Can you share a story where someone didn't do the proper planning up front and they ended up in a really bad situation, both for the individual and also the company?
Yeah, the one I'm thinking about actually is I had a client that was from Brazil. We don't have a treaty with Brazil. And Brazil is, from what I understand, really aggressive about taxing to their residents. So anything that's paid out of Brazil, they're going to tax, even if it's earned in the US. So that person came to the US. He's still employed by the Brazil company. So they're taking out all these Brazil taxes, but he's doing all the work in the US, and we have no treaty. And so now all of a sudden he's paying federal and state tax in addition to Brazil tax. And I tell you, he felt really, really poor. And there's not a lot that can be done other than, getting the company involved and trying to get them to set up a US entity so he can be totally out of Brazil. And so that was pretty painful. Lucky thing was it was a family business and they made him whole so he didn't starve and become homeless. But if they'd have just done some planning up front, they'd have known this.
So what are the steps that should be taken up front? What do you think should be done up front prior to a foreign person coming to the US going overseas, these remote workers? Your opinion.
Well, my opinion starts with find out, can you work? What is it going to be required for you to be able to work there? What visa do you need? Who has to sponsor it? How long is it going to take? It always takes longer than you think it should. Probably costs more than you think it should, but you really shouldn't be going anywhere until you know that you're going to be legal. And while you're working on that, then you need to start talking to somebody in the new country, a tax advisor, I recommend, just so you know what baggage that you need to get rid of before you come to the US. And by baggage, I mean certain assets are taxed very poorly in the US. And so we kind of need to divest ourselves of them and get into ones that are better from a US perspective if you're going to be here, or vice versa. I mean, not everybody looks at the investments the same way. They're not all taxed the same way. This wonderful, Roth IRA that we can have in the US, and you're getting close to retirement, and you really want to live down in Colombia. Colombia is probably going to want to tax that Roth IRA, and you've already paid tax on it once. You're planning on not having that. So you've got to have those conversations to figure out how you need to change your assets, if you will, that you're taking with you. Then you need to talk about, what do I need to do besides the visa to be eligible to do the job I'm supposed to do? And then from the company side, I'm sure you have tons of advice what the company should do and structures they should set up and all that kind of stuff to make it work. But really, it's about, are you legal? Get rid of the assets that are going to cause serious tax problems, because they're going to hurt you. It's going to be a painful tax. And if you'd have known about it, you'd have fixed it. So let's fix it before we go. And then making sure that you're happy once you get here. Got to go back. You got to redo all of that stuff.
So have you had situations where a taxing authority has questioned the activity taking place?
I've been really lucky. I'm very conservative, Jim. I try very hard to make sure that when we're in a gray area, we come down clearly where we think is the right answer, and we disclose it 100% so that they can't say that we've committed fraud and are hiding anything. Right. So been very lucky. I need to knock on wood. Hope the IRS isn't coming after me, but we try very hard to make sure that we over disclose if it's a questionable type item.
Are you aware of countries that are more aggressive in this area than others?
I'm aware of more states that are more aggressive. The UK is pretty aggressive. They're pretty aggressive. They want to see their piece. Sometimes you negotiate it ahead of time, so you get a good advisor there. I did have a situation in Germany early in my career. I was working with a lot of the military Department of Defense contractors. And there's what's called a SOFA agreement. It's a status of forces agreement that basically lets certain qualified people work in host countries like Germany for the US government and not pay German taxes. But it's a very specific group of people within that contract. And I had some contractors that had gotten advice from another large firm that they could exempt their admin people, their tax people, their HR people. And the SOFA agreement only applies to the really technical experts. And so, yeah, Germany was very aggressive against some of those firms to the point that some people packed up and left in the middle of the night. And the company said, if you stay, the taxes are yours. The company gave an education kind of class that I got to listen to. And it was basically get out before they catch you. If they catch you, it's your problem because we warned you.
So again, getting good advice, both from a U.S. perspective, assuming U.S. going overseas, and then talking to someone, a tax advisor, attorney in the local country to make sure you know exactly what's going on.
Right. And you've got to be transparent with them and tell them what you've got. The biggest syndrome I see, and another lens that a lot of people put on going any direction, is kind of the Las Vegas syndrome. What stays in Las Vegas, what happened in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. Their use with taxes is, well, if it happened in Germany, I don't have to tell the US. Or if it happened in the US, I don't have to tell Colombia. And you want to be very, very transparent with your tax advisors ahead of time so you know what's coming down the pike, because resident taxation is generally worldwide taxation. So if you're going to go live somewhere and you want to know what the definition of living there is, what resident means there, It may not be 183 days. It may be a month. It's the country rules.
One question that I often get asked from foreigners coming to the US and likewise US going overseas, what are some of these wage or number of days in a country threshold that would require them to have to pay taxes?
Well, again, it's not just the days that count, Jim. It's the scenario of being paid. We kind of talked about that. But it's when you move your residency sometimes, and sometimes it's a threshold. Like in the US, we have what's called the substantial presence test.
Mhm.
So in our code, we have rules that say once you cross this threshold, you are a resident. And the only way we get out of that is if we have a treaty that has the Article 4 residency clause in it, that we can say, well, wait a minute, we meet the definition, so we can still be a non-resident in the US. But the US test is actually a 3-year test. And it's in the country for any reason for those days, other than you got stuck here for medical, and if you're international flight and you never really leave the airport,
Right.
those days don't count. But when you add them up, we're still looking at what is the equivalent of a half year, but it's calculated over 3 years.
Okay.
So one of the things I tell people that are wanting to spend a lot of time in the US but don't want to be a resident, you want to be here under 120 days every year. You go over it, you're going to bust that substantial presence test, even though it's 183 days that everybody thinks about. The US counts it over a 3-year period.
Very interesting. So again, you really got to think about what you're doing as far as the number of days. 120-day rule versus I've seen a situation where they've come and they've spent about a half a year here, but not over the 183 days, and they think they're okay. And then when they find out that they have gone over the threshold amount and they do have US taxes due on their income streams, then they're in panic mode.
Yeah, and everybody is in panic, and you can avoid panic by not making an assumption. Ask somebody that knows, not at a cocktail party. And don't get diagnosed like go to the doctor at the cocktail party and say, hey, I got this spot, what's the problem? That's not the right thing. Make an appointment, pay for some time, get some good advice.
So overall, when you think about these remote workers, what do you see as the one or two things that most of them get tripped up on?
Most of them get tripped up on what I called the lens at the beginning of the thing. It's I'm working for a US company. I'm getting paid in US dollars. And this is whether you're an employee or a subcontractor, because I'm seeing it a lot with the contractors where they have one major employer. And it's not an employer, it's a contract. So that's the one thing they really do, because it takes up all their time. And we won't get into the argument of whether they're an employer or a contractor. We'll just call them a contractor. But so they, I work for only a US company. My only client's a US company. I get paid in US dollars. So I'm not, it's all US taxable. Well, you're a US person. Yes, the US wants to hear about it and you have to put it on your tax return. But if you're in another country that has a tax, they may get the first right of taxing it because that's where your feet are. And oh, by the way, you owe taxes even if you're illegal. There's nothing to say that you only pay taxes on legal income.
True. So what happens if you're taxed in both countries? What happens?
Well, it depends on how you've set it up. So if you go to another country and they get the first crack at it, but you've already paid the US taxes, and you didn't actually say that the wages were foreign, and you didn't actually claim the taxes, it's sometimes very hard to actually get out of double taxation because of the rules around the foreign tax credit. Okay, you basically have to have paid the taxes due within 2 years of the tax returns filing. And you can't elect the accrued method if you didn't on anything but an original return. So if you don't think about it and 3 years passes, you're going to be stuck with double taxation because there is no relief. And, if you qualify for the foreign earned income exclusion, yes, you can claim that late, but a lot of our cross-border remote workers are not going for an extended period of time. They're going for 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. Well, in order to get the foreign earned income exclusion, you have to be out of the US 330 days out of a 365-day period, or you have to be legally resident there. Well, we just talked about remote workers a lot of times don't think about being legal. So that's going to leave them at the what we call the physical presence test. And they have to be out 330 days out of a 365-day period. Well, if they're coming back to visit their parents for Christmas and have a nice long summer holiday, it's really easy to exceed 30 days back in the US. And then that's off the table too. So again, my best advice, figure out what you want to do and then go ask some people, how do I make it work? Don't go do it and say, fix my taxes.
So what is the process that you take potential clients through?
Well, usually I've got the panic clients because they don't ask me ahead of time. I mean, if we could get anything out there out of this podcast, it's find your tax advisor before you have the problem. Talk about it before you do something.
That's right.
When people come to me, I try to understand what they're trying to do. What is your short-term goal? What is your long-term goal? Are you planning to go forever, or is this just a trial? What other assets do you have? What are we trying to manage around? You've got to take your whole story and your whole life almost and say, this is what I got. This is what I want it to look like. How do I make it happen from your perspective, Laurie? We walk through it. And then the second part is, hey, let's find somebody where you're going and have that same conversation with them. And that way we've got both sides of the equation covered. And between the two of us, we have a pretty good network of people that we trust in other countries that actually speak English, which is really handy.
Mm-hmm.
And we can jointly work out the difficult pieces, the difficult holding, or the scenario of, ooh, that really smells like double tax. How can we restructure this to get it out of that? You can only fix problems before they happen sometimes. Sometimes once the problem's happened, it's like, you spilled milk. It's gone. So why don't we make sure the glass is good before we pour the milk in?
Well, absolutely. I think the message of seeking good advice, planning, and being open and honest about your plans can save a tremendous amount of frustration and taxes on the backside. I think my experience has been most of the remote workers, they're not thinking about any of this. They're just thinking about, I'm going to wherever, and I am going to enjoy a different work environment. I'm going to be able to go to the beach. I'm going to be able to go visit here, and no big deal. I'll just file my 1040 and I'm done. But there's so much more to it. So for those that need your advice, tell us how they can get a hold of you.
Okay, you can find my website at marsenacts.com. From there, you can actually put in a calendar request to have an introductory conversation with me. I will do a free consultation just to learn a little bit about you, not answer any questions because you can't give tax advice if you're not paid for it. It's not tax advice. It's just a conversation. But to see if we can work together, if your situation needs my help. I've had some people, say, this is a bad, this, and this, and we really, really need you. And I'm like, no, you don't. You need to think about this, and this, and then you're good. You don't need to do a big old whatever, so I'm not there to try to make you pay for taxes. I'm there to try to help you survive them, I guess. My email is also, it's Laurie at marsenacts.com. Those are the best ways to get a hold of me, is either through asking for a meeting through my website or giving me a call or giving me an email.
And your contact details will be on our website at www.globaltaxfocus.com. We'll have all of Laurie's details there. Now, what we wanted to do with this podcast was just introduce Laurie to the audience, but also to make people aware of this realm of remote workers, that it's not as simple as just taking your computer and going somewhere and starting to work. There's really a lot of intricacies, both from a tax and non-tax perspective, that you got to consider, or you can get yourself into some hot water. Laurie will be back with us on other topics. I can't encourage you enough to reach out to her. Just a deep well of experience, and what's really nice is her presentation style. She's not one of these that's going to push anything on you. She's going to present the facts based upon her knowledge, give you some guidance, and again, we encourage you. Laurie, you know you'll be back. We know you'll be back because you're just a good friend. So with that said, we wish you the very best for the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you on our next episode of Navigate. Until later, goodbye.